This episode of Horsepower Heritage is sponsored by Model Citizen Diecast. No matter what's in your garage, you can fit all your automotive heroes on a shelf. And they've got you covered, whether it's 1/43rd scale, 1/18th scale, or even the ginormous 1/8 scale masterpieces from the Amalgam Collection. Go to ModelCitizenDiecast.com and get 10% off when you use the promo code HERITAGE at checkout. Limitations apply. From race cars to street cars and everything in between, it's Model Citizen Diecast, because your inner child still wants to play with cars. Hi everybody, welcome to Horsepower Heritage. I'm Maurice Merrick. And greetings to all of you listening far and wide from places like Brooklyn, New York, Chattanooga, Tennessee, Salt Lake City, Utah, Geneva, Switzerland, Apeldoorn in the Netherlands, and Ballyman, County Longford, Ireland. Thanks for listening, and before we get started, I've just got to point out that if you're a car fan, the last few weeks have been really exciting. For example, in only their second appearance at the 24 Hours of Le Mans, Jim Glickenhaus and his team finished third overall, behind a pair of Toyotas, which is incredible. I mean, think about it. Toyota is a worldwide industrial Goliath with a $237 billion market cap, and Scuderia Cameron Glickenhaus is a cottage racing team with 12 employees, led by a maverick Wall Street guy in a black cowboy hat. And I'm hoping to have Jim Glickenhaus on the show in the near future. I've run into him a few times, and we've talked about doing it, so I guess it's just a matter of lining up our schedules. He really wanted to get Le Mans out of the way before we sat down, but I'm really excited about hearing his story. And then last week in England, we had the Goodwood Festival of Speed with all the hill climb action and lots of amazing cars, old and new. And this year, a new Goodwood record was set by the British-built McMurtry Spearling electric hypercar. 149 miles per hour, 39.08 seconds over the 1.16 mile course. And this thing was just unreal to watch. It looks like a miniature Batmobile. It's got the equivalent of 1,000 horsepower. It's carbon fiber, single seat, fully enclosed, and it weighs about 2,200 pounds. And the 0 to 60 time is 1.5 seconds. And it's got a pair of ducted fans in the rear, creating a negative pressure space under the car, which generates 4,400 pounds of downforce. And it really looked like a scale slot car flying up the hill with Max Chilton at the wheel. Absolutely wicked. And finally, I want to give a shout out to Renee Brinkerhoff from Valkyrie Racing, who had the honor of driving the Acura NSX Type S pace car at the 100th running of the Pikes Peak International Hill Climb last weekend. And you might remember that I had Renee and her daughter Christina on the show twice to talk about their expedition to the South Pole in their Porsche 356. You know, the one with the tracks in the back and the skis in the front, wild car. And if you haven't heard those episodes, go check them out. And for those of you not familiar, just to set the scene for you, Pikes Peak's course is 12.4 miles and a climb of almost 10,000 feet in that distance. And the record time up the mountain is 7 minutes, 57 seconds, set in a Volkswagen EV back in 2018. And the overall winner of Pikes Peak this year was Robin Shute in his Honda-powered Wolf GB08 single-seat open-wheeler, finishing in a little over 10 minutes and 9 seconds. And this is his third overall win at Pikes Peak, which this year was a bit slower for everyone because of some really heavy fog on the mountain. And that weather made for a hairy ascent for all the entries, including a guy, by the way, named Levi Shirley in a Campbell Ultra 4 machine. And Ultra 4 is an unlimited off-road class. So just think Baja Racing or King of the Hammers rock crawling. Anyway, Levi was jamming up through the fog and a sharp left-hander kind of snuck up on him and he lost control and rolled the car down the hill, but it landed on its wheels. So he just gassed it back up the hill and kept going, which is kind of a normal day if you're an off-road racer. But for Pikes Peak, it's a pretty wild turn of events and definitely a crowd pleaser. And Levi managed to finish the run in under 14 minutes. So as I said, lots of great summertime racing happening, lots of cool car events, plenty of the F1 season left to go, and we'll see if Red Bull continues to dominate there. And I hope you're enjoying these events as much as I am. There's so much going on. And we're coming up on the 2-year anniversary of Horsepower Heritage. And a ton of great stuff is in the pipeline. I've been super busy with interviews. I can't wait for you to hear what's next. So don't forget to click that follow button, leave me a 5-star rating and a review, tell your friends about the podcast, and that's all really important because it helps new listeners discover the show. All right, well, today my guest is automotive journalist Ronald Ahrens. Ronald spent many years as a contributor for Automobile magazine, and he's putting the finishing touches on a new book entitled The American Automobile From Flivver to Furious. How's that for a bookend of cultural references? And it's a comprehensive history of the American car industry. And although I haven't read his manuscript yet, although I hope to, I can only guess that it's a story told with Ronald's characteristic Midwestern humor. As a kid, he tagged along with his race driver dad to dirt tracks all around Nebraska and the Midwest, and it set the stage for his long writing career. But I'll let him tell you all about that. And recently, I spent a day with Ronald at his home in the California desert, and we also shot full video. That'll be up on my YouTube channel. And you can follow his work at ronaldahrens.com. There's a link in the show notes. So with that, here's my interview with Ronald Ahrens, right here on Horsepower Heritage. Let's hit it. Well, Ronald, I'm really happy we could get together today because, I've known your work for many years. I was an early subscriber to Automobile magazine in the 80s, and, I read your stuff, and it was always humorous. I felt like your writing's never been mocking or snide, but it's always been sort of like bemused about cars, the industry, and life in general.
The word someone used once was sly for my sense of humor. And
I'll go with that.
Yeah. And I like to sneak one in there, and even in the grocery store, if I can make the cashier and the other two customers laugh out loud, then I go home feeling wonderful, and it's always that kind of unexpected thing.
Were you writing early? Were you writing in high school and sort of...
I wrote a couple of letters to the editor when I was young, one of them when I was 15 to the Omaha World Herald, and I wrote directly to the sports editor, Wally Provost, and I was outraged because they didn't cover stock car racing. They gave so much coverage to minor league baseball, the Omaha Royals, and they'd get 2,700 in attendance for a game. And out at the stock car track, we had 3,000 people, and on Sunday night, and that was barely in the paper. And I protested that they should cover it more, and I never expected that this letter would be published. And we all read the paper every night, and there was my letter, part of it in Wally's column, and I was kind of mortified, really.
That wasn't just as a fan, right? There was a personal tinge to that, right?
Right. I mean, I grew up at the track, Sunset Speedway, northwest of Omaha, and also we went over across the river, the Missouri River, a lot to Playland Park Speedway.
And these are half-mile ovals?
No, they were... Sunset Speedway, which opened in 1957, was a quarter-mile oval, dirt, and then in about 64, they expanded to 3/8 mile and started racing late models instead of the old, we called them stock cars, and here they were 32 Fords and so on, and so suddenly people were racing Chevelles and Fairlanes, but across the river in Council Bluffs, that was 1/5 of a mile paved. It had been a dog track. and Playland Park was, kind of midway rides and stuff, and a racetrack. And they were racing over there in 52, maybe even earlier. So that's where that local oval track culture came from. And Sunset, when they opened in 57, it was a big deal. They were getting 75 cars for a racing program.
Wow.
Yeah. And my father raced in 57 and 58, and he won 3 feature races one year and 2 the next, which made him it was really authenticating for him to win these races, and established him as a great authority on many things. And I think it also probably overcame a lot of maybe resistance within the family on my mother's side. Like, who is this heathen from a country boy, and
who does he think he is?
Yeah, and big know-it-all. And so he backed it up,
Right.
So he probably walked around with his head held a little higher after that.
Absolutely, and he carried that with him for a long time. And then he had another run after Sunset did expand, and he was that was his second car. That was a 32 Ford sedan because the coupe bodies were all gone, by then. And he wasn't very successful with that car, and that was not easy for him, that failure. And after that, he never really drove again, except for a couple of rare occasions. But he was basically a crew chief after that. And racing was starting to get a lot more serious. Then he built a car in 74 with a man named Bob Hatterman who had just won the super stock division at Sunset. He had a 57 Chevy with a 283 engine and a 2-barrel. And if you won your championship in your class, you had to move up to the pro division. And so my dad talked him into trying this crazy experiment with a complete space frame chassis out of steel tubing. And they welded it up and everything was beautifully triangulated. And he's trying for centralization of mass and all these things. And, it was basically sports car technology, right? And he even moved the rear disc brakes inboard.
Oh, wow.
Oh, I know.
Very exotic.
And so the car was supposed to dance around the turns, and he was always arguing with people about your spring rates should be lower. You need a stiffer chassis and softer springs, and you'll just, around those corners. And poor Bob Hatterman had never raced in that big league, and it was a big step. And he had a pretty big accident at Corning, Iowa, I think, and they had to rebuild a lot of the space frame. And I don't think they even finished the season. And my dad had bought two 427 cubic inch engine blocks, which he built. And for some reason, he was pursuing this fueling strategy that left the mix too lean. And so he started melting pistons.
Right.
Oh, and then they were rebuilding engines. And I think they just ran out of money and gave up by the end of the season. And he never raced again after that. Never was involved in racing and really turned to digital technology. And he found it very rewarding to get an input and know what the output would be. And he was often seen running around with his ohm meter and his, he loved to do measurements and testing and to solve problems.
So he was a frustrated backyard engineer, really, in a way.
Yeah. My dad, Walter Carl Ahrens Jr., was like I said, country boy from the Loup River country in Nebraska and near Columbus, and dropped out of high school, but he always liked to read, and he read the screwdriver books, as we call them, popular mechanics and popular science or whatever he picked up, and he was very good at absorbing all of that kind of information, not only about engineering technology, but also astrophysics and all of those big things. And he did enroll and took courses at Omaha University. Didn't matter that you didn't have a high school diploma, but he wasn't much of a student. And this is while he was married and after I was born even. And even in 57, 58, when he was racing, they listed, in the newspaper when they wrote about him, they listed him as a student. So that's why I say on my website that he considered himself intellectually superior to these other guys at the track who mostly, they owned filling stations or repair shops and farmers, and those were his competitors. And they were, Omaha, Nebraska was a very ethnic town, with a wave after wave of migrants who came to work in the stockyards, and some of their names are remembered today in the annals of Daytona International Speedway. If you go back to the very first race It was won by Lee Petty, and second place was Johnny Beauchamp from Council Bluffs, Iowa, and the car owner was Roy Burdick from Omaha. And the Burdicks had been a very dominant racing family, and I would say they were probably Bohemians. And the other dominant driver going back into the early 50s was Bob Koziski, and he raced in 1960 at Daytona. And so we had that heritage, and honestly, my dad felt like he belonged there too, and he knew how to run a slide rule as well. So, he really belonged, and so that kind of exalted notion of himself. In addition, he read sports car magazines, so this is where he knew about space frame tech, design. And
Colin Chapman stuff.
Colin Chapman. I mean, he talked to me about Colin Chapman all the time. Here I am 8 years old, and I'm listening to him think out loud. And, Colin Chapman's motto was simplify and add lightness. So I was always hearing about lightweight cars, and our personal cars in our family were, he had a 1959 Volvo 544, PV 544, and it was kind of a crazy choice for a 27-year-old guy with a family, and Volvos were just finding their way into the heartland by then. They started on the coasts and then gradually opened dealerships in places like Omaha. And we also had a Nash Metropolitan, and I have an old photo of both of those cars in our driveway. So there was all this kind of crazy experimentation going on as well.
Obviously, it was an early way for you to relate to your dad, but you genuinely became interested in cars. You became a gearhead.
Oh, no. I was 2 years old in 57, and I went to the track. And,
yeah.
My mother told me that I called the cars putt-putts, and that I could also fall asleep during a race. It was just home for me, and I loved it. And being around all of these, these men who, they were really feeling it with what they were doing. That was a great way for people to express themselves.
Yeah. Those little ovals out in the country, there's nothing like it. That is really the lifeblood of racing in the United States. People don't realize it in the city. They think about F1 Miami and Daytona and Talladega, but those little itty bitty half-mile ovals.
And look who comes from places like that, sliding around on the dirt. You have names like Mears and Jimmy Johnson from El Cajon, and they learn how. And Tony Stewart was one who said, I like a car that moves around. And he did the NASCAR thing. I don't think his spirit was really ever there. Look what he did with his money. He bought Eldora Speedway,
Right.
And there's just something about the action on the tracks, and then the whole social side. So, I would be left up in the grandstands. Sometimes my mom came along. Sometimes I was just there. And, here I'm 8, and you come down to the last lap of the 25 lap A feature, and here is Bud Burdick leading Bob Koziski on the back straightaway of the final lap, and there's going to be contact in turns 3 and 4, right? And everybody knew it, and they would all be on their feet, and they would be jabbing their cigarette into the air and trying not to spill their beer out of the cup. And as soon as the contact occurred, and Burdick moved up the track and Koziski went under, you goddamn son of a bitch, and they didn't care if an 8-year-old was present or not. But this is how people release their emotions,
Oh yeah.
And otherwise you had to be so self-contained, in society. So that's the cool thing about racing, is that there's something thrilling and visceral that's going to happen, and people will lose their minds.
Yeah. Well, not to mention in small town America, those two guys that are dicing it out went to high school together, and maybe that guy stole the other guy's girl, stuff like that.
Well, Omaha was a medium-sized city, 300 and some thousand when I was a kid. So a lot of them probably did come from the same neighborhoods, but they got a lot of news coverage. And even in the 50s, I think the races at Playland Park Speedway were broadcast on live television.
Wow.
So they were household names. And my dad was pictured in the newspaper, and again, completely legitimized before his family. And, everybody took him seriously because of it.
Fast forward to after college, and you've got Hollywood aspirations, right?
Yeah. Well, I grew up watching Johnny Carson, and his first job was in Omaha in the early 50s, and he was born in an Iowa town, and then they moved up to Norfolk, Nebraska. So, for somebody from University of Nebraska as well, and somebody like him to make it that big, had quite a powerful effect as well. And Dick Cavett was from Lincoln. So, Nebraska people, they're real easy to talk to because they never come down hard on one side of the question or the other, and if you ask them if they were involved, they'll say, well, I might have done that if I would have been there. Everything's conditional. So they make excellent talk show hosts, and Johnny Carson was this overawing figure, and hope that's a word. And so anyway, I ran away after getting an English degree at Nebraska and was going to be a screenwriter. I actually was accepted into a program at USC, which I couldn't afford, and I dropped out after the first semester, and ended up holding cue cards on television productions. Actually worked on one show that was a network special on NBC, tribute to Jack Benny, who had died, and it was Johnny, Bob Hope, and George Burns.
Wow.
And I was holding cue cards for them,
Wow.
So, and working at NBC regularly on Days of Our Lives on Stage 9, I could go over to Stage 1 at 5:30. They would usually finish by 5:15. So I'd just wait and then go over to Stage 1, and there was a employee viewing area just off the set to watch Johnny do his monologue. I don't know, I did that 100 times, But to start, my start in writing was I'd already written a bit for the college newspaper, and then I wrote a story for Soap Opera Digest about how we did cue cards on Days of Our Lives, and somebody handed me a camera so that I could take pictures to go with this thing, and they published all of it,
Well, they say write what you know, yeah?
Yeah, right. And so that was how I started writing for magazines, and there was a certain amount of bouncing around until 1985, and my wife, I'd gotten married, my wife Susan and I were sitting around in St. George, Utah, renting a condo from her mom, and we had cable. So I started watching IndyCar racing, and they were advertising for Auto Week magazine. Get your subscription. So I did, and it was still a big newspaper back then. So cool. And there was a little item saying that this man I'd never heard of, David E. Davis Jr., who had left Car and Driver, was going to start a new magazine with backing from Rupert Murdoch, and it was going to be called Automobile. And he announced this to the Automotive Press Association in Detroit at a meeting, and he offended everybody by saying, and we're not going to cover racing because no one cares. So I thought, hey, sounds like a job opportunity. I don't know, I'll send a resume 2,000 miles away. And I never thought about it again. And like 3 weeks later, the phone rings, and it's Jean Lindemood, as she was then known, today Jean Jennings. And could you come to Ann Arbor for an interview? And I'm like, You mean you're going to pay for my ticket and you're going to fly me there and hotel and dinner and all that? So, and I got a job as associate editor. So we moved, and we arrived November 1st of 85. And there were, in this nascent organization, there were 5 employees at that time. And I was number 6, I would say. And so we went into the car magazine world that way.
Well, now, so launching it, did you feel pressure to wow them initially, or was it just a little bit of an easier entry because this was a new publication?
No, I felt pressured, and they hired me because they liked my sentences, but I had never majored in journalism or studied journalism, and I didn't know anything. I had been a freelancer, so I had no idea what an editor did. And as far as trying to build it together, I was really kind of on my own, and I was supposed to edit the news department, and I just floundered. I failed, and so they got rid of me after 6 months. And meanwhile, the first issue had come out in March. I think it was March of '86. So there'd been this build-up period. Like by the time the second issue came out, I had lost my job. But they asked me, as they're getting rid of me, to just continue as a contributor, as a freelance contributor, and do the list of auction results that I had been already doing. Vintage car auctions. That was something David E. wanted to cover. And he liked what we'd done so far. So I did that for 10 years. And I traveled. I used their cars from their press fleet, and traveled to Scottsdale for the Barrett-Jackson auctions, and also obscure regional auctions, just so that I'd have enough material to put into that column, because those companies didn't really have much PR back then, and we were just starting to use fax machines, so that was a convenient way to get some auction results. But if it was a good auction, I would go myself, And so I traveled around a lot, and it was a really good way to get educated about the American automobile in particular, and all automobiles in general. One of my first features in automobile was a story that I called A Little Gumbo Mumbo Jumbo.
I love it.
And it was about this man named George Bentley, who is from Lafayette, Louisiana, and George Bentley Cars specializes in Jaguars, and everybody knows this guy, and he'd like to take me under wing and tell me the inside scoop on things, and he was just such an extravagant character that I finally wrote, without even telling him. It was more like a memoir type piece, and we got Gary Hovland to do a great illustration, and Gary and we teamed up a number of times. But so there were characters, and through them, it was almost like listening to my dad too, get their take on whether that model Jaguar was worth your trouble, and stuff like that.
I love that stuff. That's one of the things that set the magazine apart from, let's say, Car and Driver, where you'd have, lots of specs. Yeah. Lots of engineering focus.
Right. David wanted the automobile to be features-based and not a large staff with a lot of contributors, a lot of freelance contributors. And for that, he went to Car, magazine in England. He really admired Car magazine. And so we had Phil Llewellyn writing for us, and
that's right.
Mel Nichols was a columnist for a while, and we also got their photographers, because by their standards, automobile paid a lot. So they would fly over, and Martin Goddard, and he would get a month in the U.S., and we want you to do this shoot of our new car that we're testing, but also here's one that we're testing for a year, and we'd like you to shoot that for the final wrap-up story, and then could you go down while you're in the United States and do a travel story with Ronald, and then so those guys, Colin Kerwood, Dougie Firth, and there were some others who did regular work for Automobile, and they were good. They had a lot of style.
Now, let's talk about David E. Davis, because I think he's a pretty fascinating character. He was a self-styled dandy, a little bit of a raconteur, had a bad accident, I think, in the early 60s racing.
Yeah, it was in the 50s.
Yeah.
Right, and there was madness for sports car racing, especially here on the West Coast. And he turned an MG over, and basically he suffered serious facial injuries.
Right.
And, he really didn't look that bad. And I'm sure, though, he was a very dashing 6'4" hombre,
Yeah.
and he was about 25 when that happened.
Right.
So, can't imagine the destructive impact on your self-image, But he, if anything, he overcompensated by, he was still a 6'4" commanding kind of person who, he bragged about his Savile Row tailoring, and he always had, a nice tie with a foulard pattern or a Homburg, and he even affected a cane, a walking stick, and
of course there was the mustache and beard, which was always impeccably manicured.
Yeah, and
also it served to cover up some facial disfigurement.
Right, he did the right thing, and he made himself into a commanding presence. Who, especially men were really captivated by this guy, and he was kind of loud, and he talked a lot. You knew he was there, and he basically controlled the conversation wherever he went. And I would, be off at some podunk auction somewhere, and usually people didn't know who I was or what Automobile magazine was. At that level, they're more like into Cars and Parts magazine or something,
Right.
But the few who did, they would kind of pull me aside and say, oh, what's he really like, In fact, a crazy story is that these two guys at Scottsdale, they said, why don't you come over to our motorhome and we'll make you a steak? And this is what they wanted to know, is what David was like. But when I got to the motorhome, they had this hooker there. They called her Turbo. It was kind of awkward for me because I felt like I should make conversation with her too. And I'm sure these two guys are thinking, what kind of an idiot are you? So being in David's shadow was, it was always, I guess there was a little bit of glory that, you
were basking in his glow.
Somewhat, yeah. But and he was a great writer. He had sound compositional technique and some real style that came from his, extensive reading, but also he was from a Southern family. He was from Kentucky with the great oral storytelling tradition, and his aunt, Harriet Arnau, was a famous novelist. And she lived in Ypsilanti, Michigan, and she told the story of the Kentucky Hill people who came north when Henry Ford said $5 a day. Kentucky and Tennessee emptied out, $5 a day, and so she chronicled that in her novels, and I think she maybe propelled him a little bit.
Yeah. Let's talk about your latest venture.
Yes. Well, I couldn't help myself, and I wrote a book, which exists as a manuscript, and I'm looking for a publisher, but the book is called The American Automobile From Flivver to Furious.
That's a long period there.
Yeah, I try to make it a comprehensive story of American cars and a continuous narrative that starts in 1893 with the Duryea brothers of Massachusetts and continues right up to Tesla. I visited the factory on Media Day 10 years ago, and I have an epilogue that is from 2010, and I'll leave that for later for when the book actually gets published. But it's up to more or less today. I don't think that much has happened since Tesla was launched. I mean, a lot of startups and a lot of crossover vehicles. And emphasis on, I mean, I was listening to you reading Arthur Herman and his great way of telling the general history. And my approach is different. It's more personal, and I mean, it's not a first person story, but it's my interests, and there's a lot of emphasis on using dialogue where I can find it, and song lyrics and advertising language, and to tell the story, and to write about people as well.
So with such a comprehensive history of the American automobile, was there was there a big picture lesson that you learned?
Yeah, really, I think the number one lesson is how much suffering the automotive pioneers endured in many cases, in order to bring their vision about. I mean, an example is a guy named Byron Carter from Jackson, Michigan, and he created the Carter car with the friction drive, which had, instead of a sliding gear transmission or planetary transmission, it had some friction discs inside that engaged, and I don't know how to tell you how it worked, but it was an alternative drivetrain. And Billy Durant, when he was putting General Motors together, bought Carter car. He kind of famously said, "How was I supposed to know what the engineers were going to tell me next? One day it's the friction drive, and the next day it's 2-cycle engines. And so I was for getting them all." And so Carter car was part of original General Motors. But by that time, I think that was in 2009, Byron Carter had perished because he was going across the Belle Isle Bridge in Detroit, and Belle Isle is a city park in the Detroit River, and a woman's car had stopped. So he got out to crank it, and there was that kickback problem, and it did, and it broke his arm and jaw, and poor Byron Carter died within a week of pneumonia. So that's one example of the suffering, and
sorry, I know this story, and his death inspired a pretty amazing innovation.
That's right, and it was through his friendship with Henry Leland, and by this time they were getting involved with Charles Kettering. So Leland felt so terrible that I think it was a Cadillac that had caused the accident, and he felt so terrible about having developed the car that claimed Byron Carter's life that he pushed for a solution, and they collaborated with Kettering on developing electric start, so self-starting cars. I mean, we had by then learned how to make cars in huge quantities, but they weren't that usable. You had to be a wizard to run one. And so two big problems were, how do you start the engine and how do you change the gears? So the immediate quest was to invent self-starting or perfect self-starting. And Kettering, going back, he was from National Cash Register in Dayton, which is a leading company. They knew how to make precision parts in huge quantities and a lot of innovation there. He figured out how to put an electric motor in a cash register and make things operate automations to some degree. And then he and partners founded Delco, Dayton Engineering Laboratories Company, and that was a great resource, which General Motors ended up buying later and moving to Detroit. So there was an example of, this innovation that was a response to a tragedy, and it also solved the problem of now suddenly women could more easily drive cars, operate them.
And it certainly fit with Cadillac's role as a premier automotive marque.
Right.
And in case people haven't heard my episode on the men who built General Motors, you can check that out. But I talked about Henry Leland. So Leland was an investor in the Henry Ford Company, which...
that was Ford's second company. I think his first one was named after Detroit.
The Detroit Automobile Works or something like that. And Leland took what was the remains of the Henry Ford Company that had gone into receivership, and he reconstituted it as Cadillac.
Right. With partnership from Murphy. That would be William Murphy, I think.
Right. And so, I talked about that in that episode, but this story, which is in your book, is a perfect example of stuff that I just eat up, right? Because there are so many fascinating tales of trial and error and
also, just personalities had to mesh, and Murphy and Leland grew tired of Henry Ford, kind of fiddling around and not producing cars. And then, what sealed it was that his old 999 race car that he said, I'll do this. And they're waiting to make some money on their investment. And so, they took off and they founded a new company, Cadillac. And then later, Leland got discontent with something that was going on in Cadillac, and with his nephew or son, they started another company, Lincoln,
Right. Which later became part of Ford Motor Company.
1922 is the centennial of the purchase.
And so it all comes full circle.
Yeah, no kidding. So the next big usability quest was shifting gears. And it was difficult for a lot of people. And, natural thing is what could be better? An automatic transmission. And that was development on that began in the early 30s at General Motors. And one of the young engineers who was involved in that project was named Ed Cole, who went on to have a glorious career at General Motors.
Small block Chevy.
Yeah, even before that, he was always on these cutting edge things. Like once they got an automatic transmission, the Hydra-matic, around 1939, it was in the Oldsmobile. They also put it in battle tanks right away. Cadillac built tanks, for the Army, and it was a big improvement to put I think they also put a Cadillac V8 in it at that time.
It was the M3 Stewart tank, in fact, and it had twin Cadillac V8s.
Right, each with its own automatic transmission.
Yep.
And I suppose they each ran one side of the vehicle. I don't know much more about that, but yeah.
Fascinating. So Ed Cole.
Yeah, he became, during World War II, the chief designer, I believe, for military vehicles in Cadillac. And then after the war, they went back to civilian duty, and their next goal was the overhead valve Cadillac V8, which introduced in 49. And he was so successful that they wanted him at Chevy, which was, kind of an old ladies division there. And Ford had the new 49. It was pretty hot stuff. So he became ultimately chief engineer at Chevy, and their big project was the 55 Chevy, which was all new, and it included the overhead valve V8, the Chevy small block engine, which was lighter in weight than the Cadillac, and it was easier and cheaper to build, but it was also kind of, you would say, adaptable. It was really designed maybe with an eye for motorsports and enthusiast users to create their own, heads and fueling systems and whatnot. So it was a real breakthrough. And then Cole's career, he was golden after that. He could do anything, right? He became general manager of the Chevrolet division. And what was their next big pursuit? The Corvair. They had to answer the Volkswagen, and there'd been a lot of pressure during the 50s about, George Romney was one who led that campaign against inefficiency and heavyweight cars. Romney was, CEO of American Motors, and the Rambler line was quite successful. Smaller, compact, smaller engines, and they kept winning the mobile fuel
economy
efficiency runs. Yeah. And so he had some authority behind him, and so Cole thought this was the answer to the Corvair, and really that was the beginning of a number of calamities that he was involved with, and right up to the Vega. And he was also pushing for the rotary engine during the 60s. And I think there are one Corvette mock-up with a rotary. And so he was trying all this cutting-edge stuff. And, we're still doing that today. I think we overcomplicate, because Henry Ford had it figured out. And actually I'm reading this novel right now called The Flivver King, a story of Ford America.
By the way, before you go on, Ronald, maybe we should explain what a flivver is, because it's a term that's pretty antiquated now. A lot of people don't know.
Yeah, it was one of those words. Upton Sinclair says the Model T began to get pet names: Tin Lizzie, Flivver, and I can't remember the others, but flivver was very commonly used, and there was even a Ford Flivver aircraft, which was their attempt to make a flying car, basically, for commuting around, a small, lightweight, 2-cylinder engine at first, and that was the name of the product, the Flivver. But there were only 4 or 5 prototypes made, and it ended tragically when their test pilot crashed into the Atlantic Ocean.
That was that's pretty symbolic of the arrogance of the industrial age, or the machine age, right? You think of that movie, Fritz Lang, Metropolis.
I've never seen that, but I know of it, yeah.
Right. This mechanized utopia type idea. And a lot of these guys, they sort of got an ego trip about it, I think. They had solved so many problems, especially Henry Ford, who's, half the cars in the world at one time were Model Ts. Mm-hmm. If that doesn't inflate your ego, what would? Right.
Well, Upton Sinclair, who was a very famous writer, maybe not too well remembered today, but his 1906 novel, The Jungle, was an expose about the meatpacking industry, and it led to passage of federal legislation, the Pure Food and Drug Act, and he went on for decades writing that same type of novel, like, about different industries: coal, oil, automotive. So he wrote this book, The Flivver King, a story of Ford America, and he documents the story of a common man who worked for Ford, and then tells Ford's story as well, and how he, became that billionaire with the big vision for everything. And I'm not finished with it yet, but from the beginning, like, he talks about how Ford discovered vanadium steel alloy and how cars would be lighter, stronger, and cheaper. And we've gotten, that's really all that we need, but we always have to add these systems and more of this and more of that, and we end up with, like we were talking about, the 9,000-pound Hummer EV. And it's grotesque in a way. And, again, what I've already told you about, my indoctrination by my father about lightweight vehicles, and in the spirit of Colin Chapman's Lotus and Ford. And, even Raymond Loewy was commenting on our cars are getting so heavy. Raymond Loewy, a designer who worked a lot for International Harvester and Studebaker. And there was a designer at General Motors, probably the first woman in automotive design. Her name was Helena Rother, and she said lightness is the essence of design. So there's almost been a consensus about it, and could throw in Romney as well. But somehow we end up bigger and bigger. And so Cole, his answer was aluminum engines in the Vega, and ever more exotic, manufacturing technologies and stuff. And it kind of came to naught. But nevertheless, his career, is almost unsurpassable. And, an interesting corollary to his story is, I'm a big student of the Knudsen's, and I have read their papers at the Detroit Public Library, the National Automotive History Collection, and there were two of them. The first was Bill Knudsen, Big Bill Knudsen. He was 6'3", 6'4", big shambling type of guy, and he had come from Denmark as an immigrant in 1900 and worked his way from the shipyards in New York to the Kime Bicycle Works in Buffalo, and then Henry Ford discovered him and brought him to Detroit. And Knudsen oversaw the opening of Ford's branch factories all over North America, and then even into Cadiz, Spain, and Copenhagen, and a couple others in Europe. So he really had a big hand in helping the Ford Motor Company to expand. But there was some kind of falling out, and he left Ford Motor Company and a $50,000 a year job, and he ran a manufacturing company for about a year, and then from across town, the General Motors people came in. Chevrolet was really in trouble at that time. There was a post-World War I recession, and also we mentioned Charles F. Kettering had become head of GM's R&D. He was pushing for the copper-cooled Chevy, this air-cooled engine. I don't know. It had copper fins all over it, and it was really difficult to make and expensive. And they brought Knudsen into Chevy at $50,000 a year, and he kind of eased the copper-cooled Chevy out of production, out of the plans, and just went with a sound reliable running gear. And then they kind of did a Frenchy body design, with a lot of trim and stuff, and it was successful. And by the end of the 20s, they actually were back and forth with Ford in sales leadership, and a tremendous Knudsen, with his Danish accent, he was famous for telling the team at Chevy, "I want one for one," meaning match Ford sales. And that was to some Chevy dealers who all stood up and roared their approval. And so Big Bill Knudsen became president of General Motors in 1937 after the strikes, and Alfred P. Sloan, he didn't like the UAW at all, and he kind of felt defeated, I think, by how things turned out, because Washington got involved. And so he just became executive chairman after that and let Knudsen run the company. But that was only for less than 3 years, and World War II started, and Franklin D. Roosevelt said, we need to increase our production effort, and the Office of War Production had a new chief. They brought Knudsen from Detroit and he's the guy who went out to every factory in North America and said, okay, you're building howitzers and you are going to build, armored personnel carriers. And he coordinated that whole effort, made sure they got the materials, and really led the whole arsenal of democracy, and had a glorious, actually the political part didn't go so well in Washington because there was some infighting with the bureaucrats. But
that's a shock.
Yeah, and he was an outsider, $1 a year man, and they thought he should be more of a figurehead, I suppose. But when he came back to Detroit in 46, he was greeted as a hero, and they also coincidentally had the Golden Jubilee celebration of the automobile in 46 because that was 50 years since Charles Brady King had become the first person to drive a car on the streets of Detroit, and that was the beginning of the industry. And so they really made Knudsen the exalted figure there, and he really had a glorious send out, And so meanwhile, he had a family, and his oldest son was named, in the Danish tradition, Semon Emil Knudsen. And he became known as Bunky because when the daughter came along, and the daughters all had names like Tootie and,
cutesy names?
Yeah, those diminutives. And so the first daughter comes home, and she's in the nursery with mom, and dad and son bunk together. They were bunkies. I guess that was kind of a term in current use during World War I era and after. And so he became known as Bunky Knudsen. And he looked at his dad and said, I want to be president of General Motors too. And he took all the right steps. He went to MIT, but he came home in the summers and he worked on the line at Pontiac. And so he knew how cars were put together and military stuff. And he also knew what a good factory was like and how it should operate. And he went to work, and I think they implemented statistical process control, and he had a lot to do with that. And then he worked at Allison Division in Indianapolis, where he found an inefficient factory with too much stuff stored on the premises and dirty, and people had a lackadaisical attitude, and his progress there was good. So the next job was as manager of the Pontiac division in 56. And again, it was a real sleepy division. If you think about the mid-50s Pontiacs, nothing much was happening.
Kind of a dressed up Chevrolet, really.
Yeah. But they always, from the 30s, they had their Pontiac Chieftain emblem,
right,
and their speed streaks on the side of the car. Well, he said, let's get rid of that stuff. And he hired some new engineering talent. One was a senior engineer named Elliot Pete. He was known as Pete Estes. And you know who the other one is, right?
Well, let me think. Pontiac history.
He was a young guy from Castech High in Detroit and Lawrence Technological University. And he had gone to work at Packard, but Packard was dying, and he was involved in developing the Ultramatic automatic transmission at Packard and rather distinguished himself. And so his name was John Z. DeLorean.
Oh, my goodness.
And he was part of the team with Estes and Knudsen. And Knudsen had it all down. I mean, he knew good advertising, so they started doing these fantastic ads with illustrations by, they were called Fitz and Van, and Fitzpatrick and Van Kaufman. Fitz Van, I think they were known. Unbelievable stuff. A guy named Rob Kyle has written a book about it.
I've seen the book. It's amazing. So the artwork is quite stylized. If you think long, low, and sleek, and rectilinear.
They were perfect to capture that for Pontiac, because then the engineering program was
wide track,
big engines, low, wide, the wide track Pontiac, and a whole series of great ad campaigns. And
by the way, it really fit in with the direction that Bill Mitchell took GM styling in the 60s, which was let's get rid of all the chintz and chrome and clean everything up.
Absolutely, yeah. So they, like I said, they threw the Chieftain away, and Knudsen took Pontiac to third in the industry. Sales were incredible, but see, the thing was, he was always 1/2 step behind Ed Cole on the corporate ladder. So Cole's already general manager of the Chevy division, which was the really good job and the biggest job. So then Cole moved up to become group VP for all automotive divisions, and Bunky Knudsen gets elevated to be general manager of Chevy. And he goes right back to his formula: stick in the biggest engine that you can find, and we'll really make this thing go. We'll call them super sports, and we'll stick that. And he initiated development of the Mark IV V8, the 427 cubic inch engine, and we'll stick that in a Corvette. I mean, it's outrageous what they did, right? And in 67, Ed Cole now becomes president of General Motors, which Knudsen thought he was going to get that job. And when it didn't happen, see, we know this because he kept a diary.
Oh.
Right, and that's part of the Knudsen papers in Detroit. And he was really beside himself, and he saw it coming too. So he left General Motors, which unheard of, except that his father had left Ford and gone to General Motors decades earlier, and he became the new president at another company that was challenged in the management department, and that was Ford. And so he moves to Ford. Lee Iacocca's tearing his hair out because he had just led the introduction of the Mustang, and man, he should have had that job. And so I think he devoted himself over the next 19 months to just every day was coming in to get rid of Bunky Knudsen, and meanwhile Knudsen's doing his thing again, the 428s and the 429s and the Boss and the Mach, and Iacocca sees his sweet, delicate Mustang getting developed into this big heavy thing. And so he was president of Ford for just 19 months, and then there was this utterly humiliating public press conference to announce that he was being fired. I would say Bunky's comeuppance was a vindication for Iacocca, who then went around saying, Henry Ford famously said that history is bunk. Well, today, Bunky is history. Yeah, and Knudsen went away to Cleveland and ran the White Motor Company and made trucks and tractors for 10 more years. And
reminds me of Ransom Olds, who got ousted from Oldsmobile and ended up building REO commercial trucks.
Yeah.
And some cars.
The REO Speedwagon.
That's right.
And yeah, they built a line of cars.
Yep.
They were quite successful, and they built trucks well into the 50s, I think.
Ronald, thanks for telling me these stories today. The book sounds terrific. It's right up my alley, something I want to read. I hope to read it soon. And people can catch up with you at Ronald Ahrens, AHRENS.com.
That is correct.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, man.
Yeah.
That's all for this episode of Horsepower Heritage. If you like what you've heard, go to buymeacoffee.com/HP Heritage. Support the show, tell your friends, write a review. All of that helps me reach more gearheads like you. I'll see you back here on Wednesday, July 12th with a story of one of the most legendary British motorcycles in history, the Vincent. It's a terrific tale and you won't want to miss it. So until then, I'm Maurice Merrick. Thanks for listening.